So we've seen that faces carry lots of information besides the identity of the person. Faces carry information about what a person is looking at, and so thinking about, or what their intentions or desires might be. Faces carry information about the emotions that the person might be feeling. Faces also, of course, provide an access to retrieve information about a person. So in this lesson, we're going to situate the fusiform face area within a wider cortical network, and we'll again use the computer analogy that the face area is going to feed information into these other systems for the purposes of doing useful computations. So on the input side of the fusiform face area, it receives inputs from the early visual system. We'll call this V1 here, but other early visual cortical regions send information along to the fusiform face area, as well as this other cortical region called the occipital face area, and we'll get to that in a moment. I wanted to just add one thing. After Kanwisher's lectures on the fusiform face area and how this area is selective for faces as compared to, say, objects or places, etc., I wanted to share one more type of study, and that involves a study with famous faces and then with these Mooney faces. First, the famous face. An MRI study revealed that there was higher fusiform face activity on trials where a person was looking at a famous face and they correctly identified that famous face compared to when the same face was not identified. So sometimes, you'll see a picture of a famous face and you just you won't recognize that person. Well, under those conditions, the FFA showed low response, but on the trials where that same face, so it's a same visual stimulus, on trials when it was recognized, they recorded higher fusiform face activity. So the activity of the fusiform face area is correlated to the actual act of consciously recognizing the face. In addition, down here with these stimuli, the Mooney faces, you'll recall sometimes they just look like blobs, right? So the way they're constructed, but that's actually a face in profile. And when they measure fusiform activity, the region shows higher activity when detecting the Mooney faces as faces compared to when the subject just sees a blob. Right? So again, we're seeing that correlation between FFA activity and the conscious perception of the face. If this visual stimulus is perceived as just a blob, not a face, you don't get activity in the fusiform face area. Now, let's compare and contrast these two face areas here, the occipital face area and the fusiform face area. Kanwisher and colleagues have noticed that the fusiform face area responds intensely to upright faces, but a significant reduction in response to inverted faces. And notice this is correlated to our difficulty in recognizing inverted faces. The fusiform activity is tracking that perceptual difficulty. By contrast, the occipital face area does not show a decrease in activity with inverted faces. So Kanwisher and colleagues suggest that the occipital face area is sort of sensitive to the facial features, the individual components of faces, which can be picked out of both of these faces, the upright and the inverted, while the fusiform seems to be preferentially activated by upright faces, and in particular the unique configuration of the facial features, which is correlated to the identity of the person. Now, it is thought that the occipital face area does send inputs to the fusiform face area. Damage to this area here can cause prosopagnosia. So that would make sense if the occipital face area is an important input, a source of input to the fusiform face area. But there are interesting differences between these regions. Nevertheless, they are involved in the processing of faces. So to summarize that, we'll say the occipital face area is involved in processing face features, while the fusiform face area is involved in the face configuration, right? The arrangement of the features into a coherent whole, and it must be upright. Now let's add another component to the system here. There is a region in the brain that seems preferentially activated by motion. So it can be objects moving or people moving, but it seems to be responsive to things moving in our visual scene. We're going to call this area MT. This region of the brain sends information to another region, part of what they call the superior temporal sulcus. It's this groove that runs along the temporal lobe. And as well, the fusiform face area sends inputs into this region. Now, this STS region, both MRI and fMRI and single-cell recording, has indicated that this region is also responsive to faces. But again, there's an interesting difference between how the STS face region responds and how the fusiform face area responds. The principal distinction seems to be the motion on a face. So while fusiform responds to the invariant facial features, right, related to the identity of the person, the STS face region seems to respond to the dynamic aspects of a face. Now, what do we mean by the dynamic aspects of a face? Well, that would be like an emotional expression. After all, to generate a happy face or a sad face or a fearful face or an angry face, what's happening is the facial muscles are changing the expression on the face, right? That's a dynamic process. In addition, the direction of gaze of the eyes, that's another moving component of our face. Notice then, given the nature of these inputs, this STS face area is in a good position to be computing the dynamic aspects of a face. It's getting information from the face area and the motion area, and so it seems to be representing the dynamic aspects of a face like emotional expressions and eye gaze. Now, if the STS face region is processing emotional expressions and eye gaze, it now makes sense that that area of the brain is going to send such information to those parts of the brain that are involved in computing the mental states of the person. Now think about mental states like beliefs and desires and intentions. These are mental states, we can't see them, but we have to make inferences about them. And recall that we discussed earlier that when somebody shifts their eyes to look at a new object, we can infer that they're now paying attention to that object and they're thinking about that object. So by processing eye gaze direction, that would make sense that we want to send that input to those regions of the brain that are responsible for processing mental states. Eye gaze would be a useful input to that system because what a person is looking at is going to be often what they're going to be thinking about. And in other kinds of expressions, facial expressions of desire, then we can make inferences that a person is having the mental state of desire from some of those dynamic aspects of the face. And intentions as well can be inferred from what a person is looking at or their expressions of desire. They're likely then to intend to interact with that thing that they want. So it makes sense then that we've got a region of the brain that's processing faces, motion. They converge in the STS face area to process dynamic aspects of a face, and then that information is going to be sent as an input to the mentalizing systems of the brain, where we begin to compute the mental states of other people. Now, the fusiform face area also sends information along to a subcortical structure called the amygdala. It's underneath the temporal lobe, and it's an important structure, and we'll have much more to say about it later. It used to be thought that this structure was principally involved in the emotion of fear, but recent research has changed this view. Today, researchers argue that the amygdala plays an important role for orienting our behavior and guiding our behavior and shifting our attention and modulating perception and memory. So if we think about these in turn, activation of the amygdala tends to shift our attention to the stimulus that has activated the amygdala. The amygdala is also thought to not only respond to stimuli that might be dangerous or evoke fear, but also rewarding stimuli. And this makes sense if it's going to be involved in systems to help us guide behavior. In addition, the amygdala has memory-enhancing functions. So activation of the amygdala tends to enhance the memory of whatever stimuli that activated the amygdala. So it can modulate perception and memory systems. So we can think of the amygdala in general as sort of like a salience detector. Those things that are important in the environment will activate the amygdala, and as a result, it'll shift our attention, it'll guide our behavior, it'll help us learn about those important stimuli. And for the social species that we are, people, of course, with their faces, are important stimuli in our environment. So they're going to be very salient stimuli that we need to respond to, especially if a person or environment is expressing an angry emotion, for example. That will be an extremely salient stimulus, because that angry person may be more likely to engage in aggression towards us. So the connection between the fusiform and the amygdala then provides a way that we can link emotional associations and sort of the emotional salience with faces. So certain faces, certain people have an emotional significance to us. They might be a friend or a foe, and the amygdala activity would track that kind of emotional significance about different faces. One final connection we'll mention here is that the fusiform can send visual information about faces along to the anterior portion of the temporal lobe, the ATL. And here researchers hypothesize that we store information about people. So we're going to call this region of the brain sort of like a set of person files, where we can have access to their name, the person's personality, biography, the relationship to us, the emotional significance by way of amygdala, and access to any personal memories we might have with the person. So in a sense, the face of a person is a way to access all kinds of other information about that person. And of course, that would be useful for guiding future behavior as this person comes into our environment. In summary then, in this diagram, we've instead of writing the actual locations of the brain, we've tried to put their function in this network of processing. So early visual systems are going to deliver visual information to the fusiform, where faces will be detected and recognized. Along with motion information, the STS region is going to be processing facial expressions and eye gaze, which are very important clues to make inferences about mental states like intentions, desires, beliefs. In addition, faces will have an emotional salience mediated by the amygdala, and faces will provide an entry point to access stored information about that person. All of this would be useful in guiding our behavior with respect to that person that we just identified. And now let's take a moment to see if we can do some retrieval practice.